Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kirkey. I'm the Director of the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. And we express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shanty lands and waterways. Today's webinar features the one and only Dr. Christopher Kirkey of SUNY Plattsburgh. He's going to be giving a talk today titled Canada, the United States, and the Not So Special Relationship. Christopher Kirkey is the director of the Center for the Study of Canada and the Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh. And he currently serves as past president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. He is co-editor of the Journal of Eastern Township Studies and is on numerous editorial boards, such as the American Review of Canadian Studies, the International Journal of Canadian Studies, the London Journal of Canadian Studies, etc. He's contributed to numerous volumes and book chapters and edited special journal issues, such as those made to Oxford University Press, Routledge, Palgrave Macmillan, Ottawa University Press. Very illustrious career, and we are very fortunate to have him with us here today as the first scholar in residence here at Can-Am Studies at Western Washington University. And so without further ado, we're going to hand it over to Chris, but one little bit of housekeeping. We will be answering questions at the end of today's webinar. Dr. Kirkey will be speaking for about 45 minutes approximately, give or take. And then there'll be time for questions and I will be monitoring those. We've received some that have previously been submitted via Zoom. If you do have questions during the course of today's talk, please do submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Christopher Kirkey.
Thanks, Christina, very much. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for taking your valuable time to listen to me this afternoon a little bit, talking about, as Christina suggests, Canada, the United States, and the not so special relationship. I want to begin. I've had the great fortune to be at the Center for Canadian American Studies now for a few days, and I want to thank Christina, Lisa, and the entire folks, faculty and staff for their tremendous hospitality. It has been just outstanding, and just a wonderful convivial spot to discuss research topics and teaching issues and professional development. So thank you so very much for having me. I also want to extend thanks to my colleagues back at SUNY Plattsburgh, at my institution. And of course, I want to make sure that in the context of today's conversation, and it really is a conversation, and it's this particular project, this particular conversation we're going to have comes out of a couple of things. Comes out of a long-standing partnership, research and scholarship and writing partnership with my good friend, Dr. Michael Hawes. Many of you know Michael. Michael is the Executive Director, President, CEO of Fulbright Canada, who's done more than anyone else in the past 20 years to expand opportunities for scholars and students interested in the Canada-US relationship. And Michael and I have shared, as I suggest, this long-standing commitment to trying to understand Canadian foreign policy and the Canada-US relationship. And as students of foreign policy and international relations, the second thing that sort of drives my remarks today, that, as I say, reflect a work that's coming up in a soon to be published book on the Canada-US relationship, that drove Michael and I to stand back and look at this again, is we share a deep frustration for how scholarship has sought to explain the ebbs and flows of the Canada-US relationship. And I think this will become self-evident very quickly. And I think that you'll be hopefully it'll be something that will be fresh, and I certainly welcome your comments and your observations. One final point I'll mention is I want to thank my boss, Amy Southerton, for allowing me to come out here and participate in this project. Amy, if you're here today, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So having said that, and because we're doing this via Zoom, I've got some prepared remarks which I'd like to go over. I hope they catch your attention, and I'll be nodding up and down between the camera for Zoom and my notes. So if you see me duck my head, you'll know what I'm doing. So, and thank you for your patience. So a persistent feature of scholarly inquiries dedicated to exploring the emergence and persistence of the so-called Canada-US special relationship is identifying causal factors and hallmark features linked to and indeed anchored in a place-based North American framework. Historical, social, political, economic, security, environmental, and cultural explanations specific to North America have dominated the discourse, explaining why Canada and the US developed such close ties. Colonial expansion, the critical role of migration, the intermingling of peoples, a shared commitment to liberal democratic values, ideas, institutions, and practices, the tremendous growth in cross-border economic and commercial engagement, signified most notably by the Auto Pact, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and of course, the more recent USMCA, and the protection of the continent against security threats, most visibly manifest in the establishment, operationalization, and mission expansion of NORAD. Federal and subnational agreements and treaties to advance environmental protection, the pervasive presence and role of American culture, joint participation in amateur and professional sports associations, the impacts of integrated transportation networks, and of course, the longstanding cited relationship that exists between prime ministers and presidents. All of these factors are regularly cited as crucial ingredients in facilitating a special relationship. A relationship that historians, diplomatic historians, political scientists have long characterized, particularly in the post-1945 period, as one defined by exceptionalism and exemptionalism. There is no question that these factors have all contributed to the vibrancy and long-term health of relations between Ottawa and Washington. Yet, for all the emphasis placed on domestic factors as the overriding or exclusive variables underpinning the relationship, one element that has largely been absent in our understanding of the Canada-US engagement is the prevailing distribution of power in the international political system. What I'm here today to suggest is that the number of great powers and who they are is arguably the most crucial element in shaping and influencing the direction of relations between the two nations. In fact, as I said a moment ago, most observers date this so-called special relationship to the post-45 period. There are clear reasons for that, which are fundamentally, I want to suggest, grounded in the power distribution of the international system. If you go back to the pre-1945 multipolar world, Canada, while remaining linked to the imperial parent of Great Britain, was beginning to slowly reorient or divest itself from the dominance of its colonial ties. The United States, albeit a growing point of focus for Canada during this period, would not, until the conclusion of the Second World War, emerge as Canada's principal center of international engagement. More than any single condition, the emergence of a new bipolar world and the prevailing conditions that characterize the global distribution of power and influence with only two great powers incentivized Canada and the United States to seek a highly collaborative, sustainable partnership. We also know that in 1991, the international system underwent a profound structural shift. Specifically, the post-World War II international political system that featured two great powers changed to a system, at least in the immediate aftermath of the political dissolution of the Soviet Union at Christmas of 1991, it changed to a unipolar system, with the United States being recognized as the sole great power. And some scholars, I think we're all familiar with this, have argued that, oh, that was a really brief interlude. It maybe lasted 10 or 15 years. And we're now moving, given the rise in power of China and Russia, reconstituted and more aggressive Russia, we're moving back to a multipolar world. But the argument I want to suggest today is that even though it's clear that there's a rising challenge being posed by a shift in power, that in 2023 the world still remains, in some respects, profoundly unipolar, and it has had significant implications for the Canada-US relationship. So let's go back, if we can. If I'm trying to say it's not so special, let's go back and talk a little bit about bipolarity, meaning the period immediately after the conclusion of the Second World War. And what did the emergence of a bipolar international structure involve? Now, this is something, Canada's a fairly new nation. If you go back, let's say 1867, it's just engaging in the international community. And the world from 1648 to 1945 was effectively multipolar. But bipolarity, international relations scholars will suggest, and this is where Michael and I have had difficulties, in the sense that this very profound series of insights about how the structure of the international system changes, and the balance of power and the number of great powers hasn't really been applied to understanding the Canada-US relationship in any significant way. So, by way of review, very simply, a bipolar world contains these features. Number one, only two preponderant powers were present in the international system, the US and the Soviet Union, of course. The nature of the competition in that period between those great powers, militarily, territorially, economically, ideologically, was global in scope. It was zero-sum in nature. The clarity of threat for those two great powers existed. They recognized very much that the other posed by far the greatest threat to its survival, and that the need to balance power against only one rival, in this case, when every president was trying to figure out how the Soviet Union might respond to a particular policy initiative, they focused just and overwhelmingly on what it meant in terms of a Soviet response, but it also weakened the possibility of miscalculation. And they relied, even though alliances such as NATO in the case of the West, and specifically in the case of the United States, was fostered, formed, and launched in 1949 to help maintain defensive and deterrent capabilities. The truth is, each great power was overwhelmingly self-reliant for its continued survival. And as some argued, alliances such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact merely formalized the built-in polarity in the system, and I think that's accurate. There are other factors that I can point to, but let's talk a little bit about what it meant for Canada. It's a decidedly smaller, weaker, non-great power in the Canada-US relationship. Canada was especially motivated to engage Washington across issues cooperatively. Apart from a general recognition that the international system was bipolar, the overriding consideration for Canada was that the United States played a key leadership role. As an ally of the United States in a clearly defined, a clearly structured environment, Canada's maneuverability was circumscribed and constrained. For the most part, its bargaining and influence, both with the United States and on the management and direction of salient issues in international politics, was at best muted. Canada depended on the United States for its continued existence in the nuclear age. It was, as one scholar said, a consumer of security. Restraints on independent foreign policy initiatives that challenged the core direction of American security and economic policies were both tangible and real. And in that environment, security trumped trade. Canada would have had considerable less influence and fewer opportunities, and of course, the constraints would have been even more significant had one of the two great powers not been the United States. In short, Canada's long-standing positive relationship with the US described by a former scholar of international relations, Arnold Wolfers, as the extreme of amity, directly served to prevent the country from being subjected to the full range of structural effects smaller, less powerful states commonly experience in a bipolar world. The height of Canada's leverage with the United States in the post-45 period came in the late 1940s and continued through the early 1960s. I think we know that during this time, the principal means available to the Soviet Union to launch a devastating nuclear attack against the United States was by long-range bomber aircraft, an attack that would have needed to use Canadian airspace and overfly Canadian territory en route to the United States. The need for the US, therefore, to access Canadian airspace and territory to counter this threat benefited Canada. Canada's ability to demonstrate that it was effectively contributing to the defense of the West, albeit selectively and on a small military, economic, and human scale, was necessary. Now let's talk a little bit about unipolarity, if we can, and how the world changed in 1991. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we ushered in an unexpected, frankly, and a decidedly unanticipated period, with the United States being the sole great power in the international political system. And when you look at what and how an international system, political system such as ours works when it's unipolar, and what that means for Canada-US relations, it's quite fascinating. First, some of the principal characteristics. Obviously, there's an imbalance, a disproportionate imbalance of power and influence in the world vested in only one state, in this case, the United States. There was an absence of imminent hostile state-level or national threats to the survival of that great power. There was an increase of influence also for the sole great power and considerably less restraint on its international behavior, because the structural nature of a non-zero-sum unipolar environment is decidedly more permissive, and it disposes and encourages states with considerable material capabilities to do things that they like to do. Stop and think. Every president from Harry Truman to George H.W. Bush, if they were pulling a particular lever, economic, diplomatic, military lever of foreign policy, making a significant decision, their principal consideration was, how will the Kremlin, how will the Soviet Union respond to this? Well, Bill Clinton, who arguably had the easiest stretch of being a president in terms of the exercise of American foreign policy in the last easy 135 years, comes to power, and he doesn't, when he wakes up in the morning, he's not thinking about that. As we all know, Russia was a bit of a internal, well, let's just say they were grappling with a lot of domestic, political, social, economic issues, and weren't as engaged as they typically would be under the Soviet Union in terms of foreign policy. So the dynamics that are inherent in this unipolar structure facilitate a relaxed and a permissive environment, not just for the United States, but for all states. And states that have sufficient capabilities do things that they are more prone to do or not be able to do under conditions of bipolarity. And often, and we should expect to see this, great powers should not have been expected and are not expected post-1991 to favor or choose to follow the norms, rules, and conditions central to international institutions and multilateral arrangements. This is not, a lot of people look at various presidents who've come in, and most notably Donald Trump, and say, oh, this, he's upending the whole card. He has no interest in participating in the post-World War II arrangements that so effectively guided American foreign policy and so effectively helped to forge a very tight Canada-US relationship. And we know, the record is very clear, between 2016 and 2018 that Mr. Trump wasn't really fond of Canada, fond of Justin Trudeau as the Prime Minister of Canada, and of the policies that sort of, particularly, I may say a word or two about Mr. Trump's position in the Canadian response on questions of NAFTA or NATO this afternoon. But the point is, this was, as I'll come back to say in a moment, this was bound to happen. A lot of people thought, alliances, Canada, the United States, formative partners since May 12th of 1958 in this thing called NORAD, right? And in part, it's expanded its mission clearly, but it provides for the territorial integrity of the North American continental airspace. And, maybe NORAD or NATO will go away. There's no longer a Warsaw Pact. But what, quite frankly, international relations theory tells us and how it impacts Canada-US relations is that partnerships and the number of partners operating in alliances, they're not going to go away. They're in fact going to expand. And there's reasons, clear reasons for why alliances expand, not only in terms of their political numbers, but their territorial reach and their commitments, operational commitments. We saw this very clearly with NATO in the context, and we've seen it with, in some respects, NORAD. So now, whether we're in a permanent state of unipolarity or not is important. I don't think anybody suggests we're there. I think most, as I said a moment ago, candidates, when they're looking at how the Canada-US relationship plays out, they do so in the context of, the changes in international power over time. Let's consider now what the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the emergence of this unipolar system led by Canada's principal ally has meant for the Canada-US relationship, and specifically for Canada. How has Canada's approach toward navigating the special relationship changed, if you will? Well, I think the first and most important thing for Canada is to recognize that the sole remaining great power as of 1991 was and is indeed the United States. Had it been the Soviet Union, for example, it would have been a very different response on the part of Canada. What I and Michael would like to argue is that the dynamics of the current system have in fact further eroded Canada's ability to influence the United States. We've never found it to be particularly meaningful from 1945 to 1991, but it's even less so today, except on issues of tremendous need to the United States and in the absence of attractive alternatives. A critical constraint that is largely overlooked and little understood is Canada's ability in a unipolar world to convince the sole great power, as I suggest, a longstanding friend and ally, to make a meaningful commitment to pressing issues in the international political system. While specific issues that suggest or perhaps demand international attention may be compelling to Ottawa, there is no guarantee of interest in Washington, let alone a commitment to American engagement. Indeed, the incentive system for the sole great power is to be less involved than they were, for example, during the bipolar period. In a bipolar environment, issues are examined and decisions are taken based on a competitive zero-sum calculus, but that compelling dynamic, intimately responsible for shaping a wide range of foreign policy behaviors, no longer prevails in our current world. Under these circumstances, I'd like to suggest to you today that Canada is less likely to defer or unquestionably conform to the policies, interests, and rules advanced by the United States. In a unipolar world, active participation in multilateral forums and international institutions is more important for Canada and much less crucial for the United States. In an environment where consistently securing the involvement of the great powers proves to be challenging, Ottawa's foreign policy should be marked by increased efforts to ensure the regularized cooperation of other states in the international political system. Many states will similarly require coordinated, collaborative international action to achieve their foreign policy objectives. The structural logic of such a system suggests that Canada will continue, and we see this very well documented empirically, participating in previously established international institutions and rules-based multilateral arrangements for two key reasons. Why? First, it helps offset the external behavior of the great power by attempting to modify or constrain the use of unilateral US power. And secondly, it provides fora through which Canada can enhance its foreign policy autonomy and international standing. Indeed, if you had an assignment today and I said to you, go back and take a look at Canada's engagement with the international community since 1991. And you came back and you said, well, I've looked at the period under Jean Chrétien as prime minister from 93 2003 to 2003, and I've looked at the period under Paul Martin, 2003 to 2006, and I've looked at Stephen Harper, 2006 to 2015, and now I've looked at Justin Trudeau over the last 8 years. And you come back and say, my God, there's some wildly different policy initiatives that were pursued here. You know, you have under Jean Chrétien, you had a foreign minister who championed this thing called the Human Security Initiative, which meant that foreign policy and international relations had to put the viability and the welfare of individuals on this planet as the primary consideration in shaping foreign policy. And therefore, Canada pursues such things as a convention to ban landmines or the creation of an international criminal court. But yet then you see other prime ministers, you see Stephen Harper, who under both conservative minority and majority governments, he strongly emphasized defense and security, participated in significant combat operations in both Afghanistan and Libya. He offered unquestioning support to the Israeli state despite its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, the increased expansion of West Bank settlements. He strongly supported Ukraine after initial Russian incursions into the Ukraine territory. And when you see Mr. Trudeau, all of a sudden in 2015, there's an enormous sea change in the focus of Canadian foreign policy, one that's based on so-called constructive engagement, focused on things such as climate change and the question of gender representation in the formulation and operationalization of Canadian foreign policy and other such things. So somebody would look at all this as an assignment and say, oh, there's this wide variation in policies. And there have been. The reason, the principle, the overriding reason isn't because you do have different political parties and you have different political preferences and you have different bureaucratic interests at work. But what really needs to be recognized is that Canada's ability to conduct its foreign policy changed fundamentally in 1991. The same sort of flexibility and lack of constraints that characterize American foreign policy also characterize Canadian foreign policy. Canada had much more wiggle room and determination. So you should expect, it's not counterintuitive, this is what you should expect to see, wide variations in Canadian foreign policy platforms, and we do. So for the United States, it's and the Canada-U.S. relationship, for the United States, Canada, I love to say that when Joe Biden wakes up in the morning, and this holds true for every president, it's not like Canada is at the top, or the Canada-U.S. relationship is at the top of the political agenda. We're fortunate. I mean, if somebody, senior decision makers at the State Department, the NSC, Department of Defense, if Canada's number 43 on that agenda, Canada, there are far more pressing foreign policy concerns to Washington than Canada. There's a tremendous and important effort by Canadian officials, federal and provincial, folks who work in the Canadian Foreign Service to make sure that Canada is considered not only at the White House, but obviously at Congress, to be a regularized feature and concern, and making sure that the vibrancy of that relationship is maintained. I certainly think that with our current president, Joe Biden, he's committed to that. But the truth is, it's a different world right now, and as such, that may be changing. Some would suggest, with the rise of Russian and Chinese challenges, that the need for a more collaborative engagement and cooperation with Canada may be returning. That having been said, let me say a couple things about how the unipolar world has changed the United States, particularly under Donald Trump, and how that impacted the Canada-U.S. not so special relationship. Trump's doctrine, often billed as America First, was an interesting period for American foreign policy scholars, because it's clear that he fundamentally sought to redefine and reimagine what America's national interests were and how the nation engaged the world. At its core, Trump's doctrine was driven by a political calculus grounded in the unwavering belief that American participation in the world was too expansive and decidedly too expensive. Perhaps more to the point, the burden of leadership from Trump's perspective was not equitably shared. If you looked at American commitments, most especially existing international and institutionalized multilateral trade and security agreements, such as the United Nations or arrangements, the World Trade Organization, the G7, NATO, they were, as constituted, they perceived, and at least he perceived them, as serving the needs of others, not the United States. Costs associated with these operations were being disproportionately unfairly underwritten by the United States, a practice he claimed that had to stop. So when you look at foreign policy toward Canada under Donald Trump, amongst a subset of his larger foreign policy views, there was a clear and repeated effort to, quote unquote, correct these imbalances. You can go through a long laundry list of the international agreements that were viewed as being counterproductive to American national interests: Trans-Pacific Partnership was shelved, Paris Climate Agreement, retreat from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran's nuclear activities, the scrapping of the immediate removal, I shouldn't say scrapping, but the withdrawal from the Immediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. These were all, to various degrees, dismissed, criticized, and then abandoned. And then if you look at the countries, the nations that Donald Trump in this unipolar world sought to reconfigure and remove from, and you can go, it's such a long laundry list. But most interestingly, for our purposes this afternoon, Canada's on that list. And he really sought, as we know, right from the time he was trying to secure the Republican presidential nomination in 2016, he basically said there's a lot of problems with this relationship with Canada, particularly NAFTA and NATO. Those were, I guess, the two poster childs, if you would be. I do want to make one point, though, and that I think, for a lot of scholars and a lot of practitioners and a lot of observers of the Canada-US relationship and of American foreign policy, the fact that a guy like Trump would come along, who would so publicly and repeatedly and openly criticize allies, suggest that Mr. Trudeau was weak and dishonest, suggest that Canada wasn't pulling its weight in a variety of things, suggests that Canada's dairy industry, as established under the North American Free Trade Agreement, was a persistent protectionist body. All these sorts of criticisms, I want to suggest to you today, should not come as a surprise, in the sense that it's not so much that it's Donald Trump, and clearly it is, but the truth is, the fact that an American president, when 1991 came, the world changed, that we should have expected, because the incentives and constraints of how states operate, particularly in the context of Canada, the US, we should not have in any way been surprised by the fact that at some point a president was going to come along and sort of say, this so-called special relationship, it's not so special. And not only is it not so special, there are fundamental problems with it that need to be redressed or outright eliminated. And as I suggest to you, you can go back and you look at President Trump's press conferences, his speeches, his Twitter statements, time and again. Canada was taking advantage of the United States. And things like NAFTA needed to be immediately renegotiated or scrapped altogether. In fact, when you look at the empirical evidence with regard to the Canada-US relationship and moving from NAFTA to the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is signed on November 30th of 2018 at an international summit meeting in Buenos Aires, and you look at how that unfolded, it's fascinating because clearly there wasn't a lot of movement between Canada and the United States. Canadian officials were reluctant for the most part to consider significant changes to that agreement. And it took until, September of 2018, when basically the United States and Mexico announced that they had agreed to revise key elements of NAFTA. And there was this possibility of, wow, maybe there's going to be a bilateral agreement to get things moving. And in fact, in September, late September of 2018, there was some, cold and perhaps unconstructive language unveiled toward Canada by President Trump, September 26th. He said that Canada, at a special session of the United Nations General Assembly, was treating the United States very badly. He even went so far, as we know, to say that if Canada didn't get its act together and agree to substantially and reasonably negotiate a new trilateral trade arrangement, that the United States would expeditiously move to impose a significant new 25% tax on any car exported from the US into Canada. A move, some suggested, that might put upwards of 250,000 people out of work and significantly damage the Canadian economy. As Trump said, frankly, we're thinking about taxing cars coming in from Canada. That's the mother lode. That's the big one. We're very unhappy with Canada's negotiations and negotiating style. I don't like NAFTA. I've never liked it. It's been terrible for the United States. It's been great for Canada and Mexico. By the way, we're very well along with Mexico. The relationship is very good. We'll see what happens with Canada. They're charging us 300% tariffs on dairy. We can't allow that to happen. And I think, once again, without getting into the granular details here, we know that after a weekend of intense video link negotiations at the end of September between officials in Washington and Ottawa, both parties ultimately agreed on revisions to NAFTA, which allowed Canada and the United States and Mexico to move forward with the USMCA. But this sort of finger pointing and demands for change were not simply focused on the case of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I mean, you look at NATO. I mean, and it's not really helpful that in the last 10 days or so, top secret documents have been leaked that suggest that the Prime Minister of Canada has, despite claims that Canada will try or would, in fact, meet the 2% of GDP, spending on national defense efforts that was part of the 2014 NATO Wales summit, where all NATO signatories, including Canada, said we're going to do this. And, Canada continues to spend a small amount. And as Mr. Trudeau recently disclosed, supposedly privately, that Canada has no intention of moving in that direction. And it's not possible. So when you look at what Donald Trump had to say about Canada's commitment, and Canada, at the end of the day, just know this, that, and this has been a long-standing concern. It's not specific to Donald Trump. I mean, you can go back and you find sources from the 1960s that suggest that Canada was sort of a free rider and that only a few nations in NATO spent less than Canada as a percentage of GDP on military commitment to NATO. The Trudeau government took two positions to try and offset that concern by saying that it was going to expand its commitment and lead NATO's multinational force battle group in Latvia, and that it would assume NATO's new multinational non-combat training and capacity building in Iraq for the first year of operation. And there were other issues that came up. This sort of slowly went off and quietly as Mr. Trump started to turn his attention to re-election off as a point of irritation in the Canada-US relationship. I'm going to close this afternoon. As I said, I'll be delighted to engage in conversation with you with the following. I'm convinced, Michael and I are convinced, that any meaningful scholarly examination of the vibrancy of the Canada-US relationship, be it deemed unique or not, has to recognize and incorporate the influence of the distribution of power in the international political system as a necessary and crucial variable. I'm not here to suggest today that what we sometimes call systemic forces are exclusively determinative or what we need only to look at if we're to fully understand the foreign policy of states and hence the contours of the Canada-US relationship. It is absolutely essential to acknowledge and understand that explanations based, as almost every analysis is, when you look at the Canada-US relationship, it's based on what we call North American place-based forces, especially domestic politics, societal forces, and governmental processes are, by their very nature, going to be incomplete. Our position, my position, is that it is vital to factor in both the constraints and the opportunities imposed by the structural realities of the international system in which Canada and the United States find themselves in. The shape of Canada-US relations, be they special or not so special, are indeed fundamentally a response to and a result of that reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirkey. Truly a wonderful talk. Very informative for many of us in the on the Zoom. I am sure of that. We do have some time for questions, and some have come through on the chat. I'm going to start with one that is it was more of a generic question. I think a good one to lead off
Okay.
for today's discussion. And that is, what are the greatest challenges with the Canadian-American relationship going forward?
The flow, the vibrancy, the health, if you will, of the Canada-US relationship, as I've suggested, is a reflection of and response to international and domestic factors. And internationally speaking, I think it's going to be driven by how we see changes in terms of which states over time emerge as not only considerably greater concerns when it comes to threat, but just in terms of their engagement in the world. We're seeing China, for example. Most scholars would say that China is really proactively involved and has been for a number of years, and even more so in the world militarily, economically. But as far as militarily goes, apart from sort of their neighborhood, if you will, where they're very active, there's no yet display of projections of force on any significant basis in a global capacity. That would be a concern, I think, and would certainly shape things. And then more at the domestic level, once again, some of the key considerations are who's the prime minister, who's the president. What take do they have on how their approach towards the Canada-US relationship works? There's, what irritants are going to come up, and there's always going to be irritants. Sometimes they just get kicked down the road, or they get managed in a way that makes things okay, but not necessarily a long-term solution. Those are, so it's a combination of sort of domestic, international, short and long-term considerations.
Thank you. One has just come through again on the chat and asks if, do you not think, or could you comment on whether or not bi or tripolar relationships are coming back, particularly when we consider the interest of Russia and China in the Arctic?
I think every scholar, every student who's taken an introduction to international relations class who's worth their salt and who paid attention in that class would certainly say that, look, if you look at the history of how this world operates, and how great powers ebb and flow over time, that there's no suggestion that the United States would ever be in a permanent position of unipolarity, that clearly great powers fall and they rise. And the suggestion, as I said earlier, is that we may be moving to a new system. Some suggest we're already there. It could be bipolar, could be multipolar. And I think to a certain degree, that style of system, bipolarity and multipolarity in particular, would benefit the Canada-US relationship. And it would incentivize, particularly Washington, to work more closely with Canada. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, the world is also, as much as we've talked about this the dissolution of the Soviet Union, emergence of unipolarity, and so on. Arguably, the single biggest change that we've been going through in the international system is sort of what's been going on with Russia. Not its attack necessarily on the Ukraine, but Russia is in fundamental ways, I mean, it's still engaged in the international community in certain ways, but fundamentally it's being ostracized and it's decoupled. I mean, as I said earlier, Russia was a big question mark after 1991. And then there was a decision that, for a variety of reasons, including the need to provide international order, that it was in the community's best interest to bring along, to integrate Russia into that system. That's, that decoupling, if you will, you could argue is taking place in a very forceful way. And what impact is that going to have? And, at least we've begun to see it with economically with regard to China and a retreat from a closer relationship. And the relationship with China, for example, in the international community, and particularly the United States, I mean, that's new. I mean, you go back and look at Kissinger and Nixon and why they decided that a rapprochement was necessary and sort of balance of power considerations at the time. But all of a sudden, it seems to be we're stepping back from that. And I'm not entirely certain that that's a positive development. So.
Excellent. Another one that has come through reads as follows. Why is it that the number of great powers and who they are is arguably the most crucial element in shaping and influencing the direction of relations between the two nations? And how does this influence of global power shape the current relationship that we share?
Okay. I think, in some respects, as a scholar and as a student of the Canada-US relationship and international relations, how you respond to that kind of question in part depends on what your discipline is, what your academic discipline is. If you're a historian or an economist, cultural anthropologist, you may be inclined, and I think you would be, to cite other forces, as I say, most of which would be domestic, place-based, North American types of factors that influence that relationship. As an international relations student and scholar, my understanding of how the world operates and the principal forces in which Canada and the US and its relationship operate is to say they don't operate in a vacuum. Yes, there are domestic factors at play, important domestic factors, but guess what? That relationship plays out within the fluid confines of an international political system, a system that's clearly anarchic with no central overarching authority, where states have unequal material capabilities, where they pursue national, not international interests, and that states try and balance power and they work to preserve order through internal and external means. And so that sort of element of understanding, and particularly how many great powers are great powers at a given time, I think is absolutely fundamental. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that it's necessary I don't think it's polite. I think it's necessary, and it's long overdue um, among scholars to recognize this and to wed any fundamental, meaningful analysis of the vibrancy of the Canada-US relationship to the state of the world in which Canada and the US operate and live. So,
Thank you, Chris. I think we have time for one more, and this is actually coming in from one of our classes, on Ted Alden's class. And many of these questions are actually all tying into each other, and it directly relates actually to the second question that was asked on the relationship between Canada and the US in regards to China. And they're just looking for some clarity on whether or not there's a sense of growing threat from China has forced Canada and the US into a closer relationship. Maybe you could expand on that.
a simple answer, yes, because the operations mechanics of how international systems work, our current international system, and how many great powers there are, and who the great powers are. I mean, is it a case? You've seen this bit of a love fest between China and Russia. And you say, oh my God, what the hell's going on over there in Beijing and Moscow? They're embracing themselves and each other like they never have in the past. What's going on? Well, as a student of international relations, will tell you is because, they're trying to balance the power of the United States. And so, to the extent that China, as per the questioner's request, is emerging and has emerged as an even stronger power in the international system, should we expect that to incentivize Washington and Ottawa, if they share a similar perception of a potential threat posed by the Chinese, to work more closely together, not only on security issues, on migration issues, on intelligence issues, on security? Absolutely. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that's going to change anytime soon. What I will tell you is it's always fascinating to watch how debates take place in countries about perceptions, about intentions of individual nations. So I think it's fair to say, and this reminds me very much of the post 1945 period when both the United States and Canada were trying to assess, evaluate, and determine what made the Soviet Union tick. What were they all about, and what did it mean, and how do we have to orient our foreign policy in that direction, right? Today's world with regard to China is very similar. So today, in the case of China, the United States foreign policy community came to the conclusion, and its political elites, regardless of political stripe, came to the conclusion quicker. And this is not to be unexpected, because this is what great powers do. They have to. Than Canada did, that China's a real concern here. And a concern, be it, in the Arctic, wherever you want to measure that concern. No question. And as I say, it reminds me, if you look at the scholarship of the post-1945 period, it's clear that Washington, which was after Roosevelt's death in April of 1945, it took time for Truman and his advisors, folks at the State Department, the War Department, to ultimately determine what made the Soviet Union tick. It wasn't until into 46, because of Soviet actions, and obviously, I think, George Kennan's cable as political attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Washington, in Moscow, sorry, in February of 46, when he sent over the 8,000 word long telegram that said, look, this is what drives the Soviets, and that is an unrelenting desire to preserve autocratic rule. And they are an inherently expansionist society, culturally, economically, politically, and of course, militarily. And therefore, what came next was a determination by American policy leaders of a need to, quote unquote, contain this potential expansionist tendencies of the Soviet Union. And that's a policy that every American foreign policy leader pursued right through till its Moscow, I should say the USSR, politically dissolved. Canada, you take a look at the scholarship and the empirical record, it's very clear it took a little bit longer for Canada to come to that conclusion. But I do think that both powers, and I'm going to say as a scholar of international relations and foreign policy, I'm finally happy to see that Canada is beginning to realize of the need to take fundamentally more significant actions. And I think that's only going to increase over time toward the Chinese.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Dr. Kirkey, for your wonderful lecture and question answering. For those of you joining us today, thank you again on behalf of the Center for Canadian American Studies. We are so grateful for your participation, and also to all our friends over at the Alumni Association. We appreciate you hosting us today and doing all the behind the scenes work. Thank you for co-sponsoring. And there will be a recording available of this talk within a few days' time. So check your inboxes and we'd be happy to share it. So without further ado, have a wonderful rest of your day and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Take care.